As you doubtless have surmised, the root word of perennialism is perennial. The philosophy of perennialism advances the idea that the focus of education should be the universal truths conveyed through the classic and profound thoughts and works that have lasted through the centuries and have recurred in each generation. Like a perennial plant that returns year after year, these thoughts and works are everlasting. They've withstood the test of time and are as important and relevant today as they were when first conceived. The enduring wisdom of the past is a guide to the present. Examples of these classic materials include works of great literature, findings of great scientists, and timeless concepts of history. High school students study Shakespeare's plays, Homer's Iliad, Melville's Moby Dick, Newton's laws of motion, Einstein's theories, and other works that have become part of today's classic repertoire. Students take courses that focus on the traditional subjects of reading, writing, language, mathematics, science, history, and the arts. Elementary and middle school students prepare for more advanced work by studying basic subjects from the perspective of the classic tradition in a tightly controlled and well-disciplined atmosphere. The perennialist believes the emphasis of school should be the mastery of content and the development of reasoning skills in the arts and sciences, and that thoughtful consideration of the classical works is the way these goals can be achieved. Perennialists believe that truth does not depend on time or place, but rather is the same for all people. They believe the same curriculum should be required of all students. Their reasoning is twofold. One, because the goal of school is to teach the truth, and the truth is the same for everyone, the curriculum must be the same. Because people are born equal and have the same opportunities, to give some students a curriculum that is different from that of others is to treat them differently and is a form of discrimination. Who decides what should be taught? Society at large makes these decisions because it is society that has validated the importance of these works over time and has continued to hold these classics in high esteem. Many individuals have assembled canons of material they believe should be taught. Noteworthy is Mortimer Adler, whose 1982 work, The Paideia Proposal, describes a system of education based on the classics. His book has led to the development of an innovative school model called the Paideia program, which several hundred schools in all grade levels throughout the United States have adopted. The Paideia program calls for all students to study a single, rigorous curriculum in which the only elective is a foreign language. Teachers in the program use three basic methods of teaching: didactic teaching, in which the teacher lectures; Socratic seminars, in which the teacher uses directed questioning to help students arrive at desirable answers; and coaching, in which the teacher coaches students in the academic subjects. The Socratic method is patterned after the way Socrates taught. He believed people were born with all the information they need in life, and that all people were born with the same basic information. This information was already present at birth, but it was hidden. He believed that through skillful question and discussion sessions with students, he was able to get his students to bring this hidden information to the surface. And in the 1930s, Adler and Robert Maynard Hutchins, then president of the University of Chicago, organized the classics into a set of more than 400 works titled Great Books of the Western World, 1952, which they believed would enable students to become independent and critical thinkers. They held that people can discover the truths through their senses and their reasoning, that they do not construct truths because they are already in existence. The great books of the Western world represent the fruit of these discoveries made by other people. As students read and discuss them, they too can encounter the great truths of the universe. Of course, because the perennialist believes the primary goal of school is for students to learn what others have created and to use this knowledge in their own lives, the teacher is expected to present this material to the students. There is little or no room for students to venture into tangents of their own interest. The curriculum must be covered. The teacher's role is to impart knowledge. To do this, teachers hold seminars, engage students in Socratic discussions, foster directed readings of great books, explain principles and concepts, and lecture as effectively as possible, presenting dynamic lessons with all the interest-grabbing devices available. The work is demanding, and the classroom is disciplined. The student's role is to discuss, examine, and re-examine the information presented by the teacher with the ultimate goal of learning the content. Mortimer Jerome Adler was born in New York City, the son of an immigrant jewelry salesman. He dropped out of school at the age of 14 to become a copy boy for a New York newspaper, but hoping to become a journalist, he took courses in writing at Columbia University. While there, he became intensely interested in philosophy. He completed his coursework, but did not graduate because he had not completed the physical education requirement. He later earned his PhD at Columbia. Adler served as a professor of psychology at Columbia during the 1920s, and he taught at the University of Chicago during the 1930s. At the University of Chicago, he advocated the adoption of the classics as a main part of the curriculum, although the rest of the faculty disagreed. Adler believed in providing the same liberal education without electives or vocational classes for all people. He believed education should teach people to think critically, to use their leisure time well, to earn their living ethically, and to be responsible citizens in a democracy. He believed that people should become lifelong learners. Mortimer Adler is best known in the education community for his devotion to the adoption of the classics as the mainstream of education, the Paideia schools, and his insistence that students read key works of Western literature and philosophy. Philosophies are not just windy abstractions of ivory tower thinkers. Rather, they shape what people teach and how they teach it. The first two schools of philosophy, perennialism and essentialism, stress the importance of subject matter knowledge in education. Both schools of thought show a strong allegiance to the curriculum, and both argue that well-educated students should possess a defined body of knowledge. Perennialism, derived primarily from the writings of Plato, views truth and nature, in particular human nature, as constant, objective, and unchanging. Beneath the superficial differences from one century or decade to the next, the rules that govern the world and the characteristics that make up human nature stay the same. The purpose of life, according to Plato, was the search for these constant and changeless truths, which reside in the nature of things. This search was achieved through the Socratic dialogue, or dialectic, a process in which ideas are debated in a back-and-forth discussion until some recognizable clarity, the light, was reached. Essential to undertaking such a pursuit was mental discipline and a rational thought process. Education is crucial to perennialists because it develops a person's mental discipline and rationality, which are necessary to the search for truths that will help humans avoid being dominated by the instinctual or animal-like side of human nature. Perennialism in the school. For the perennialist, the purpose of education is to find the changeless truth, which is best revealed in the enduring classics of Western culture. Classical thought, then, should be emphasized as a subject matter in schools. Perennialists believe that schools should teach disciplined knowledge through the traditional subjects of history, language, mathematics, science, and the arts. Perennialists place particular emphasis on literature and the humanities, because these subjects provide the greatest insight into the human condition. Although this view of the curriculum is evident in many areas of education, in its most complete form, it is known as the Great Books approach, developed by Robert Maynard Hutchins, who was president and chancellor at the University of Chicago throughout the 1930s and 1940s, and the recently deceased Mortimer Adler, a professor at the University of Chicago during the same time period. The Great Books, which constitute a shelf of volumes stretching from Homer's Iliad to Albert Einstein's On the Electrodynamics of Moving Bodies, are a perennialist's ideal curriculum. For perennialists, the development of the intellect is best achieved through a teacher-directed instructional approach in the early years of schooling. Socratic dialogue is then used to help mature learners question and examine their beliefs in order to move closer to the truth. Since the early 1990s, a controversy has arisen over the content of perennialist literature, history, and philosophy courses. Scholars and students have criticized colleges and high schools for promoting a Eurocentric view of knowledge and culture, one that ignores the contributions of all but dead white male writers and thinkers. They urge a more inclusive curriculum, one that gives greater attention to women, minorities, and Eastern, African, and Hispanic cultures. Whereas some take this movement as a direct attack on the perennialist curriculum, others see it as a natural and useful extension of the perennialists' search for the best of the world's wisdom. One perennialist friend of ours, who welcomes this new approach, suggested, sure, students should know about Islamic literature and Eastern philosophy, but they should first get to know their own neighborhood, Western culture. The Paideia Proposal. For the perennialist, then, immersion in these great works helps students reach the perennialist goal, which is a state of human excellence that the ancients call paideia. This is a state not only of enlightenment, but also of goodness. As such, it is a goal that the perennialists believe all humans should seek. In the 1980s, Mortimer Adler and a group of educators breathed new life into perennialism with the publication of the Paideia Proposal, and then a series of supporting books. The Paideia Proposal presents this educational philosophy not as an austere, joyless curriculum, but as an exciting, involving intellectual and aesthetic journey. Several of the Paideia group who worked with Adler in formulating this plan are both minority group members and superintendents of big city school districts serving a large population of poor and minority students. Much of the appeal of the Paideia Proposal is that it asserts that all children, not just the gifted or the privileged children of the rich, should have this classical education. Members of the Paideia group see it as providing both quality and equality in education. Nevertheless, interest in the Paideia Proposal has faded somewhat in recent years, and another curricular movement has attracted the interest of educators with perennialist leanings. Education, then, is of great importance to perennialists, but it is an education that is rigorous and demanding. Perennialists hold that education is preparation for life and should therefore not attempt to imitate life or be lifelike. Students should engage in a rigorous examination of the classics in order to discover the timeless wisdom embodied therein, rather than focusing on knowledge that might seem personally meaningful. In summary, the perennialist view is that one learns through disciplined study of the great works and ideas of the past. It is a view that leans heavily on the authority of the collected wisdom of the past and looks to traditional thought to guide us in the present. As such, the curriculum is structured and clearly defined. Further, perennialists see education as protecting and conserving the best thought from the past. In this sense, the perennialist favors a very traditional or conservative as in conserving the best of the past, view of education. Essentialism. The philosophy of essentialism takes its name from the word essential. The essentialist believes there are certain basic or essential knowledge, skills, and understandings students should master. Essentialists assert that over time, society has found that certain skills, such as reading, writing, computing, and in today's world, computer skills, are needed for people to function effectively. Accordingly, certain subjects, such as the language arts, mathematics, science, history, and in today's world, computer training, are essential for people to gain the knowledge and skills they need. According to the essentialist viewpoint, this knowledge and these skills will always be needed. Thus, we can say that society at large decides, in general, what these essentials are. Businesses, banks, manufacturers, retailers, and others provide input to the institutions of education, detailing the strengths and weaknesses they see in high school graduates. The educators, in turn, use this input to help them develop programs of study that will prepare students to enter the workforce. Because most of the people who provide input into the educational system are concerned with students mastering the basic skills of reading, writing, and basic mathematics, the 3 R's, the programs developed naturally reflect these concerns. Thus, essentialism can be termed the back-to-basics approach to education. Essentialism has been the guiding philosophy of American education for a very long time. The Soviet launching of Sputnik in October 1957 rekindled this thinking. The United States felt deeply humiliated by the Soviet success. American scientists had been working on launching an American spacecraft for a number of years. Americans asked, how did this happen? How did the United States, with all its technological capabilities, all its talent, and all its money, not achieve the goal of being first in space? As so often happens, education took much of the blame. Two opposing views addressed the seeming weakness in American education. One advocated an increased emphasis on education in science, mathematics, and technology, and an increase in inquiry teaching strategies. This thrust was strengthened by the Woods Hole Conference of 1959, chaired by Jerome Bruner and attended by scientists, mathematicians, psychologists, and technology specialists. The conference affirmed the increasing momentum in science, mathematics, and technology education and called for studying less material, but studying it in greater depth and requiring students to inquire and figure things out for themselves. The other view was a growing concern that American students were not mastering the basic material of reading, writing, mathematics, science, and other areas. This concern was later highlighted in A Nation at Risk, the 1983 report of the President's Commission on Excellence in Education. The report essentially said that American children were at risk for lagging behind other nations in achievement of basic subjects, and that we had better teach our children to read, write, and do mathematics, and we had better do it now. In 1998, the Center for Education Reform reaffirmed these findings in A Nation Still at Risk. These same concerns are the chief underliers of the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. This wide support for a back-to-basics curriculum and the emphasis on basic subjects has eclipsed the recommendations made at the Woods Hole Conference. In essentialist education, students receive instruction in the basic subjects of reading, writing, mathematics, science, history, foreign language, and technology. Unlike perennialism, which emphasizes a canon of great works and classics, essentialism emphasizes fundamental knowledge and skills that business and political leaders believe members of today's society need to know to be more productive in the workplace. Teachers transmit this essential knowledge and expect students to learn it. The teacher is considered the repository of knowledge to be transmitted. This means educators develop and employ a sequence of topics in each subject that progresses from less complex to more complex material through successive grade levels. It also means using lecture and recitation, discussion, drill, and practice, and a variety of teaching and learning materials to ensure that students learn the content. For example, a middle grade social studies teacher might give a lecture on why large cities are located where they are, using maps and videos as aids, rather than having students investigate the phenomenon for themselves by engaging in map exploration activities. The role of the students is to learn the content and skills being taught and to demonstrate their mastery of them on achievement tests, often in the form of standardized tests that are used to make local, regional, statewide, and national comparisons. E.D. Hirsch has written extensively on what should be included in essentialist education. His works include Cultural Literacy, What Every American Needs to Know, the Dictionary of Cultural Literacy, and a First Dictionary of Cultural Literacy, What Our Children Need to Know. In addition, he has published several volumes in his Core Knowledge series that deal with what children in elementary grades should know. Hirsch's work could be considered perennialist in nature except for its emphasis on science, which reflects the essentialist viewpoint. E.D. Hirsch, Jr. is a prominent figure in the theories underlying essentialist education. He holds degrees from Cornell and Yale and is a professor of education and the humanities at the University of West Virginia. He's a founder and chairman of the Core Knowledge Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to the establishment of a curriculum of core knowledge, a sequenced body of knowledge recommended by the foundation to be taught in preschool through 8th grade. The foundation is a major source of research, theory, and practical lessons and assessments for all recommended subjects in pre-K through 8 schools. Although his core knowledge schools operate nationwide, critics have challenged Hirsch's essentialist theories, contending that students who use the core knowledge curriculum are taught what to think rather than how to think, and that the perspective is Eurocentric, giving only minor attention to non-Eurocentric influences. Essentialism. Essentialism is a uniquely American philosophy of education which began in the 1930s and 1940s as a reaction to what was seen as an overemphasis on a child-centered approach to education and a concern that students were not gaining appropriate and adequate knowledge in schools. The roots of essentialism. Essentialism has its philosophical origins in 2 older philosophies and draws something from each. From Plato's idealism, it takes the view of the mind as the central tool for understanding an objective and unchanging reality, as well as for learning the essential ideas and knowledge that we need to live well. From Aristotle's realism, it takes the tenet that the mind learns through contact with the physical world. Therefore, to know reality, we must learn to observe and measure the physical world accurately. From our observations, we use our reasoning ability to gain new knowledge. This contrasts with the perennialist view that reasoning alone can lead to truth. The essentialists believe that there exists a critical core of information and skill that an educated person must have. Further, essentialists are convinced that the overwhelming number of children can and should learn this core of essential material. The school, then, should be organized to transmit this knowledge and skill as effectively as possible. For the essentialists, then, the methods used to transmit this knowledge and skill are not specifically prescribed. The focus is, instead, on the knowledge that is gained by the students. Essentialism begins to sound a good deal like perennialism. Although these 2 views have much in common, some important differences exist between them. For one thing, essentialists do not focus as intently on truths as do perennialists. They are less concerned with the classics as being the primary repository of worthwhile knowledge. They search for what will help a person live a productive life today, and if the current realities strongly suggest that students need to graduate from high school with computer literacy, the essentialist will find a place for this training in the curriculum. In this regard, essentialists are very practical. Whereas the perennialist will hold fast to the great books, the essentialist will make more room for scientific, technical, and even vocational emphases in the curriculum. Essentialists see themselves as valuing the past, but not being captured by it. The philosophy behind the core knowledge program, discussed in the chapter entitled What is Taught, which speaks out in detail about what students from kindergarten to 8th grade should know, is probably best categorized as essentialist. Based on the book Cultural Literacy by E.D. Hirsch, Jr., this content-rich curriculum stresses academics and learning of specific knowledge. While its emphasis on important ideas and great works of the past makes it attractive to perennialists, the curriculum's focus on current literature and emphasis on science point more to its alignment with the essentialist movement. Currently, the core knowledge curriculum is being used in more than 600 schools. Essentialist goals and practices. For essentialists, the aim of education is to teach the young the essentials they need to live well in the modern world. To realize this goal, schools should focus on the established disciplines, which are the containers of organized knowledge. The elementary years should concentrate on the basics, such as the 3 R's. These and other foundational tools are needed to gain access to the disciplined knowledge with which one begins to come in contact in high school. Although there is some debate about what is essential in the curriculum, essentialists believe this is not a debate to which children can contribute fruitfully. Therefore, the role of the student is simply that of learner. The individual child's interests, motivations, and psychological states are not given much attention, nor do essentialists hold fast to what they would call a romantic view of children as being naturally good. They see the students as not evil, but as deficient and needing discipline and pressure to keep learning. School is viewed as a place where children come to learn what they need to know. Teachers are not guides, but authorities. The student's job is to listen and learn. Given the imperfect state of the students, the teacher must be ingenious in finding ways to engage their imaginations and minds. One notable essentialist was James Bryan Conant, a Harvard professor and president for much of the first half of the 20th century. Concerned about disparities in the knowledge and skills that different high school students brought with them to college, Conant argued for standardization of college requirements for high school students. He was also influential in the establishment of the SAT as a measure of essential knowledge a potential college student needs to possess. The Back to Basics movement of the 1980s was also an essentialist-driven reaction to schooling in the 1960s and 1970s, during which core academic studies took a backseat to individual self-fulfillment and social equity. In contrast to perennialism and essentialism, Romanticism looks first to the learner rather than the curriculum. Child-centered paradigms consider the development of the learner to be the main purpose of education. Romanticism, sometimes called naturalism, is based on the writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, an 18th century Swiss-French philosopher. In a condemnation of society and the educational system of the time, Rousseau wrote Émile, a novel that details Rousseau's ideas about education through the example of a fictional young boy, Émile. The Education of Émile. Rousseau believed that children are born good and pure, but once exposed to the evils of society, they become corrupted. To keep children good, they need to be isolated from society for as long as possible. Rousseau describes a serene, yet well-controlled and rustic environment for the ideal education of Émile. He's to be educated by a private tutor at the country's manor where he lives. Émile's education begins with his exploration of the world of nature surrounding him. From his observations, he may ask questions about the natural world that the tutor answers. There are no formal lessons, no books to read or facts to memorize, no specific curriculum to learn. Émile decides what he learns about and when. As Émile matures, the tutor helps him develop rational thinking skills, but Émile continues to decide the topics of study. When Émile is around 15, he's slowly introduced to certain social situations until he is deemed ready by his tutor to resist the evils of society and live a productive life in the social world. By the time he's 20, Émile is ready to take a mate and make a life for himself. Implications for education. Unlike the perennialists and essentialists who highlight the importance of educating the individual for society, the Romantics consider the individual more important than the needs of society. For the Romantics, the purpose of education is individual self-fulfillment, which means that education must help the student develop physically, intellectually, socially, and morally, usually in that order. Romantics believe that education is a natural process, one that grows out of children's innate curiosity. This curiosity is most obvious during the why phase of childhood, when nearly every utterance out of the child's mouth is another question. Why is the dog barking? Why is the boy sad? Why is the bird blue? Parents often want to ask in return, why do you ask so many questions? Romantics argue that we must let children's interests and curiosity drive their learning. The teacher's job is to respond to the children's questions as they arise and not to impose the learning of subjects that are not of interest to the child. The learner's responsibility is to maintain his or her natural curiosity and desire to learn. Because learning is guided by student interests, there is no set or common curriculum of study for the Romantics. Some students may be interested in kayaking, while others want to study photography, and still others may be fascinated by how a DVD player works. As students pursue their own areas of study, the approach to teaching and learning also becomes individualized. Much of the learning is self-directed and self-guided by the students, with teachers serving as sources of information or resources to help the students satisfy their curiosity rather than as taskmasters or authorities on knowledge. Romanticism has been especially influential in the early childhood and elementary grades. Many early childhood educators, including such pioneers as Maria Montessori, Friedrich Froebel, and Johann Pestalozzi, basically agreed with Rousseau's ideas about humans' innate curiosity and using the child's interest to define the curriculum. Although none proposed as radical a school setting as Rousseau's pastoral manner, they did adopt some of Rousseau's other ideas about education, such as providing young children with extensive opportunities to manipulate wooden blocks and clay and other real materials.
Today, schools like Summerhill in Suffolk, England, and the Sudbury Valley School in Framingham, Massachusetts, embody many of the beliefs of the Romantics. At these schools, there are no set curricula, no formal classes, and no tests. Students decide what they want to study, and in some cases are expected to take responsibility for their learning.
Existentialism focuses on the existence of the individual. Existentialists emphasize that people are responsible for defining themselves. To exist is to choose, and the choices people make define who they are. According to the existentialist point of view, people have two choices. They can either define themselves, or they can choose to be defined by others. The existentialist believes the only truth is the truth determined by the individual. Individuals determine for themselves what is meant by such terms as right, wrong, beautiful, ugly, true, false, and the like. The existentialist truly believes beauty is in the eye of the beholder. The existentialist believes that, whereas the great thinkers of the past had their own ways of thinking about life in the natural world, their thoughts were uniquely theirs, and today's students need to find their own ways of thinking and develop their own conclusions. In the existentialist classroom, students determine what they need to study, guided of course by the teacher. The idea is for students to come to their own understandings. Because every student is different, no single set of learning outcomes is appropriate for all students. Teachers and the school lay out topics that are considered appropriate for the students at each grade level to study, and the students make their own meaningful choices. The teacher is a facilitator, working with each student to help him or her find appropriate materials and the best methods of study. The teacher is a resource, one of many resources that also include other students, books, great works, contemporary works, the internet, and other technological resources, television programs, newspapers, and magazines, and other people. In the existentialist classroom, students do many different things and study many different topics at the same time. For example, in a science class, a group of 3 or 4 students might be dissecting a frog, using models, manuals, and drawings to guide their work. Another group might be watching a video on the human circulatory system using headphones, and yet another group might be recording the observations they had previously made of the night sky in chart form. The teacher moves from group to group, working to facilitate the investigations, probing for understandings, and challenging students' conclusions. The role of the student is to pursue his or her investigations of the chosen topic until the desired learnings and understandings have taken place. Jean-Paul Sartre, a leader of existentialism, was born in Paris. After earning his doctorate, he taught philosophy in French high schools until he was drafted into the army at the start of World War II. He was captured by Germans but escaped and became a leader in the resistance movement. The philosophy of existentialism became very popular in Europe after the war. According to existentialism, we first exist, and then we define ourselves through the choices we make. Sartre believed man's responsibility is vested in man himself. People are entitled to be human with dignity, and a human is a human only when he or she is entirely free and accepts responsibility for this freedom. Sartre's basic premise was that life has no meaning or purpose except for the personal goals each person sets. This philosophy captured the attention of post-World War II Europeans who were yearning for freedom, and it is embraced today by people who believe they have the freedom to take responsibility for their own actions. Although Sartre was principally a novelist, essayist, and playwright, his works captured the essence of his philosophy and have become the underpinnings of today's application of existentialism to education. The educational philosophy of progressivism takes its name from the word progressive. The dictionary defines progressive as making use of or interested in new ideas, findings, or opportunities, and an educational theory marked by emphasis on the individual child, informality of classroom procedure, and encouragement of self-expression. Thus, the philosophy of progressivism espouses the idea that the focus of education should be students rather than content, and that whatever is taught should be meaningful. To the progressivist, the purpose of education is to prepare students to be lifelong learners in an ever-changing society. One of the key figures in the progressive movement was John Dewey.
Dewey's writings and his work at the laboratory school at the University of Chicago, where he tested and refined his educational ideas, have produced tremendous innovations in American education. To Dewey, the traditional school where students sat in rows and passively received information imparted by the teacher was ineffective. He argued that if students are to learn, they must be involved with real problems and meaningful questions, must solve problems according to a scientific method, must be free to develop their own theories and their own conceptualizations, and must be encouraged to test their conclusions in real situations. The progressivist movement focused on several basic principles. Students should be free to develop naturally. Student interest should guide the teaching. The teacher should be a guide, not a taskmaster. Student development should involve the whole student and should include physical, mental, moral, and social growth. Schools should attend to the physical development of students. There should be school-home cooperation to meet the needs of students realistically. Progressivists focus the curriculum on the needs of the students. These needs include academic, social, and physical needs and are fueled by the interests of the students. Therefore, the material to be studied is determined jointly among the school, the teacher, and the students. Learning is considered a natural response to curiosity and the need to solve problems. In the progressivist school, teachers exposed students to many new developments in science, technology, literature, and the arts to show that knowledge is constantly changing. Progressivists believe there are great ideas and thoughts of the past that students should study, but they also believe knowledge is changing, and the job of students is to learn how to learn so that they can cope successfully with new challenges in life and discover what truths are relevant to the present. Of prime importance is the idea that knowledge that is true in the present may not be true in the future. Costa and Liebman estimate that by the year 2020, the amount of knowledge in the world will double every 73 days. Not only is knowledge expected to grow exponentially, but new knowledge will replace old knowledge, and old knowledge will become obsolete. The progressivist teacher engages students in inquiries that the students themselves develop. Students learn from one another, so the progressivist classroom fosters social learning by having students working in cooperative groups. The progressivist teacher is a facilitator, a resource person, and a co-inquirer. The primary role of students is to develop new and deeper understandings continuously through their own investigation. Thus, in an elementary education, progressivist mathematics class dealing with place value, we see children in small groups using various kinds of manipulatives to develop their own understandings of place value and helping each other clarify their ideas. The teacher facilitates these activities but does not lecture. Born on a farm near Burlington, Vermont, John Dewey was arguably the most influential American educator in the 20th century. He graduated from the University of Vermont, and after 3 years of teaching, he earned his doctorate at Johns Hopkins University. Dewey taught philosophy at the University of Michigan and the University of Minnesota before becoming chair of the Department of Philosophy, Psychology, and Pedagogy at the University of Chicago. He developed the university's laboratory school in 1896 and directed it for the next 7 years, pioneering experimental efforts and translating their results into practice. Because of disagreements with the university over the laboratory school, Dewey left in 1904 to become a professor of philosophy at Columbia University. In addition to his contributions in the areas of philosophy, psychology, politics, and social thought, Dewey was instrumental in developing modern education theory. His was a prominent voice in educational philosophy with an emphasis on progressivism. He rejected authoritarian teaching methods and advocated the importance of experiential education, learning by doing. He also stressed the importance of the development of the person. Dewey's ideas were adopted by the progressivist education movement, but they frequently were distorted, with the result that, contrary to Dewey's intentions, subject matter education was often neglected in favor of classroom entertainment or vocational education. To some of Dewey's admirers, he was the greatest educator who ever lived. On the other hand, many attribute the ills of American education to the influence of his ideas. Whatever one believes about John Dewey, there is no mistaking the fact that he taught generations of students to examine ideas carefully and objectively before deciding on their own conclusions or course of action. Several of Dewey's quotes are apropos. Anyone who has begun to think places some portion of the world in jeopardy. Education is not preparation for life. Education is life itself. And every great advance in science has issued from a new audacity of the imagination.
In contrast to perennialism and essentialism, the next two schools of philosophy, Romanticism and Progressivism, look first to the learner rather than the curriculum. Both consider the development of the learner to be the main purpose of education. A well-educated person does not necessarily have a definite body of knowledge. Rather, a well-educated person is able to function well in society and life. Progressivism is a relatively young philosophy of education. It came to prominence in the 1920s, growing out of the progressive political and social movement of the time. It drew from some of the ideas of Rousseau and from the work of John Dewey, the most influential educational philosopher of the 20th century. Progressivism views nature as being in flux, as ever-changing. Therefore, knowledge must continually be redefined and rediscovered to keep up with that change. Whereas other philosophies see the mind as a jug to be filled with truth, or as a muscle that needs to be exercised and conditioned, the progressive views the mind as a problem solver. Like the romantic, the progressive believes that people are naturally exploring, inquiring entities. When faced with an obstacle, they will try to find a way to overcome it. When faced with a question, they will try to find an answer. For the progressive, education aims to develop this problem-solving ability. Progressive educators believe that the place to begin is with the student rather than with the subject matter. The teacher identifies what the student's interests and concerns are and tries to shape problems around them. The student's motivation to solve the problem is the key, and posing problems based on student interests helps heighten their motivation. The teacher then helps the student develop strategies to solve the problem posed. Students should start with simple study projects and gradually learn more systematic ways to investigate until they finally master a variety of problem-solving strategies. Rather than being a presenter of knowledge or a taskmaster, the teacher is an intellectual guide, a facilitator in the problem-solving process. Students are encouraged to be imaginative and resourceful in solving problems. They are directed to a variety of methods, from reading books and studying the traditional disciplines to performing experiments and analyzing data. Method is of great importance to the progressive. On the other hand, knowledge, formal, traditional knowledge, is not given the same honored place. For the progressive, there is really no special sacred knowledge or subject matter which students must learn. The value of knowledge resides in its ability to solve human problems. Regarding the school curriculum, progressives believe that a student can learn problem-solving skills from electronics just as easily as from Latin, from scientific agriculture just as well as from geometry. The focus for progressive educators is teaching students how to think rather than what to think. Progressive teachers often use traditional subject matter, but they use it differently from the way it's used in the traditional classroom. Because the problems students are trying to solve are of paramount importance, the subjects contribute primarily through providing contexts for problems students must solve. Subject matter knowledge may also provide information that leads to solutions. It is the process, not the product, which is of greater importance. Although both romantic and progressive educators start with the student's interests, progressives have more structure behind their teaching, and they have goals for their students, to which we turn now. Unlike the romantic educator who may see society as a negative influence on the student, the progressive sees society as an integral aspect of a student's life. Progressives view school as small societies in themselves, places where students are learning as they live life, not simply preparing for life. This gives the progressive school a unique atmosphere, different from a perennialist storehouse of wisdom or a place with the clearly defined roles and authority structures of the essentialists. Progressive educators believe the school should be democratic in structure so that children can learn to live well in a democracy and become good citizens. They emphasize group activity and group problem solving so that students learn to work with others and help others. This is one reason many teachers who describe themselves as progressive educators are enthusiastic about cooperative learning strategies. Implicit in the progressive approach is the belief that children must not only learn to solve their own problems, but also help to solve those of their neighbors. For progressives, one of the main purposes of education is to make society better, which requires people working together to solve problems. It is not uncommon for the problem-solving activities of the progressive school to spill out into the community and involve students in issues like ecology and poverty. In this way, students learn an important principle of progressive education. Knowledge should be used to redesign or improve the world. One notable progressive educator was William Hurd Kilpatrick, 1871 and 1965, who was a professor of philosophy of education at Columbia University in New York. He was a follower of many of Dewey's ideas about education, but differed on the importance of subject matter in a child's educational experience. Rejecting formal curriculum study, he developed the project method of education, in which students work in groups on a topic of interest to them. He believed that students learn only what is of interest to them, so that they should be the ones to determine the topics of study. He also helped to found Bennington College in Vermont, which still embodies the progressive philosophy. Both progressive and essentialist educators claim their particular approach is the true American philosophy of education. One can make a case that they both are, but each reflects different aspects of the American personality. Progressivism represents our anti-authoritarian, experimental, and visionary side. Essentialism speaks to our more practical, structured, and task-oriented side. In recent years, many of the tensions and public debates in American education can be traced to struggles between these two philosophies of education. Clearly, though, essentialist educators gained ground on progressive educators in the 1980s and 1990s. Concerns over the country's global economic competitiveness and the perceived softness of our schools have created a receptive climate for essentialist views. Social reconstructionism is particularly germane in today's shrinking world. As its name suggests, the social reconstructionist philosophy of education asserts that society needs to be changed, reconstructed, and that schools are the ideal instrument to foster such changes. Social reconstructionists believe that world crises require the use of education to facilitate the development of a new social order, one that is truly democratic in nature. Schools are seen as agents of the reformation of society rather than as transmitters of knowledge. To this end, teachers help their students understand the validity and urgency of social problems, the determination of which of the many important and controversial social problems should be studied is made through democratic consensus of the students under the leadership of the teacher. There is an abundance of social problems at the local, national, and global levels that can be the focus of the curriculum. Examples include violence, hunger, poverty, terrorism, inflation, inequality, racism, sexism, homophobia, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, pollution, homelessness, substance abuse, and many others. In social reconstructionism, the students select the social priorities to be studied and decide on the educational objectives to be attained from the study. The curriculum integrates all of the traditional subjects into single thematic interdisciplinary units. The students and teachers work together to uncover, solve, and propose solutions to the selected problems. The teacher helps students explore the problems, suggest alternative perspectives, and facilitates student analysis and conclusion formation. Throughout the study, the teacher models the democratic process. Teaching methodologies include simulation, role-playing, group work, internships, work-study programs, and other forms of cooperation with the community and its resources. Similar to their role in the existentialist classroom, students in a social reconstructionist class engage in many different activities to study the agreed-upon topic, such as researching through the internet, reading case histories, analyzing multiple aspects of the topic, formulating predictions, proposing and justifying workable revisions and solutions, and taking action to implement these solutions.
A good example of a social reconstructionist issue is a problem that captured the attention of a university class in 1999. Northwestern University journalism students teamed with the Chicago Tribune to investigate the trials and backgrounds of death row inmates in Illinois. Their work showed that some of the inmates were innocent. This uncovered serious flaws in the state's death penalty system and resulted in the release of several death row inmates. This series of investigations has prompted additional investigations which in turn have freed numerous death row convicts and has changed the way the United States thinks about capital punishment. In another example, social reconstructionists have fostered the development of nationwide literacy programs, especially for students in urban schools, helping poor urban students to become resilient, to change their communities, and thus improve their lives. A social reconstructionist curriculum can help students become successful in school by encouraging them to develop a sense of self-worth. This can occur by engaging students in activities that will instill purpose to their lives, providing them with a sense of accomplishment and providing them with a support system. Among these activities are service learning and experiential learning activities that simultaneously foster students' academic achievement and respond to community needs. As you can infer, social reconstructionist principles are important in helping guide schools, teachers, and students toward a multicultural emphasis. Social reconstructionism is a very influential and powerful philosophy, especially when its goals of social reform are combined with other philosophies such as progressivism and existentialism. Critics of social reconstructionism are concerned with its singularity of purpose, the formation of a utopian democratic world society, and the indoctrination of students into this purpose. However, the New World Order of the 21st century may well need the type of impact that can be given by students whose education is provided in a social reconstructionist environment.
The investigation into educational thought would not be complete without a look at the basic and pervasive psychologies of education, or better known as our paradigms that are associated with psychology. Whereas one's philosophy focuses on the now familiar questions of what should be taught, how it should be taught, and what teachers and students should do in the teaching and learning process, our paradigms that come from psychology deal with ways in which the mind actually behaves while it is learning. That is, how learning occurs. As you will see, paradigms from psychology exert strong influences on teaching and philosophical practices, and teaching and philosophical practices exert strong influences on paradigms from psychology. They help provide structures for teaching methodologies, curriculum selection, and assessment procedures. You will examine paradigms from psychology in detail as you progress through our program. As with philosophy, there are no right or wrong paradigms. During this discussion, you will examine your own thoughts and form your own conclusions. In doing so, you are forming the platform on which you will construct your personal conceptualization of excellence in teaching. In other words, your teaching philosophy. And as you have seen, excellent teachers have many different qualities. There are many paradigms or psychologies, many ways of explaining how people learn and what motivates them to behave the way they do. In this section, we focus on 4 paradigms that have different understandings of the human mind and therefore different applications in school. The influence of psychological theories. Since early in the 20th century, educational practice has been greatly influenced by the discipline of psychology. Psychology, the scientific study of the mind and human behavior, was a natural influence on the work of teachers, particularly with its focus on how we learn. Over the years, various schools of psychology have emerged, often having roots in particular philosophies. Some of these psychological theories have had a great deal to say to educators. 2 in particular have had an impact on our schools: behaviorism and cognitive psychology. The paradigm called humanism emphasizes people's intrinsic capacities for personal growth and their abilities and desires to control their own destinies. Humanists believe people are capable of learning through their own efforts. Skip to the next paragraph. Humanism was formalized as a psychology, but we're calling it a paradigm, in the 1960s. The humanist believes it is necessary for teachers to understand the perceptions of individual students, to find how things seem from the student's point of view. Humanists see two basic components of learning. Number one, the acquisition of information, and two, the individual's personalization and internalization of that information. According to the humanist, teachers not only must know their subjects and see that the material is properly organized and presented, but also must help students make personal meaning out of the material. Humanism is well represented by the work of Glasser and Combs, and also by the work of Maslow and Rogers. Abraham Maslow developed a hierarchical theory of human motivation that asserts that people become self-actualized to accomplish higher motives after they have fulfilled certain basic needs. Carl Rogers developed the person-centered approach to psychology that says if we approach a person with empathy, genuineness, and non-possessive warmth, we can enable that person to grow and develop maximally. Rogers believed that people have a natural desire to learn, and that learning must be meaningful, self-initiated, and free from threat. To Rogers, the teacher is a facilitator of learning, acting as a guide, and providing students with the needed resources. Does this sound familiar? It should sound familiar. It should sound a lot like both Romanticism as well as existentialism, because these three paradigms have a great deal in common. Rather than focusing exclusively on the material to be taught, humanist educators also focus on the people who are doing the learning. They focus on people's feelings, interests, likes, dislikes, abilities, and other personal qualities. The humanist educator believes learning is an inside job, that people learn through their own intrinsic efforts. This contrasts with other approaches that focus on pouring the information into the student without particular regard for the individual. Humanist educators believe teachers are not essential as a condition for learning. Students can learn through their own internal efforts. They believe teachers cannot teach something to an entire class of students and expect every student will learn it. Humanist teachers adopt a position of facilitator to help students find and implement their most effective ways of learning. Behaviorism is a psychology that contends that learning as exhibited by one's behavior is shaped by the environment. According to behaviorists, the behavior of an individual is formed more by the actions and reactions of other people than by the individual's own free will. The psychology of behaviorism arose in the late 1940s and was based on the work of the Russian Ivan Pavlov, who developed the concept of classical conditioning through his research with dogs. In Pavlov's scheme, dogs can be conditioned to salivate in response to the ringing of bells as well as the presence of food, even though bell ringing has nothing to do with actually receiving food. B.F. Skinner extended the work of Pavlov to develop his operant conditioning theory. According to Skinner, a person's behavior is a function of its consequences. That is, it is what happens afterward, not before, that influences behavior. This has come to be known as behaviorism. To visualize this theory, imagine a student who takes an algebra test. The teacher announces that a candy bar will be given to every student who earns a perfect score. Our student gets a perfect score on the first test, gets the candy bar, and, according to behavioral theory, studies hard for the next test because of the expected reward. As another example, suppose you begin a conversation with your neighbor during class. The instructor stops the class and reprimands you. According to behavioral theory, you will not talk with your neighbor again because you want to avoid similar consequences in the future. It is the reprimand that has shaped your future behavior. It is what happened afterward that influences your future behavior. The basic principle is that the consequences of any behavior will cause an increase, decrease, or no change in the likelihood of that behavior occurring again. The psychology of behaviorism has wide use in the classroom. As you can imagine, numerous classroom and behavior management strategies, such as the rules, rewards, punishment approach, are grounded in behaviorism. Many instructional strategies are behaviorist in nature. Programmed instruction was one of the earliest educational applications of behaviorism. This has given way to computer programs, interactive CD-ROMs, computer-based tutorial programs, and other computer-assisted instruction applications.
Behaviorist teachers tend to favor drill, repetition, and reward-based teaching methodologies. Much debate surrounds the efficacy of using a behavioral approach in motivation. Certainly there are times when rewards and punishments foster students' attainment of desired goals. We all are behaviorists to some extent. Who, for example, has not wondered how much credit would be given for certain tasks accompanying their college courses? Indeed, report cards themselves can be considered behaviorist in nature. There's ongoing debate between those who believe humanism is the best approach to education and those who believe behaviorism is the best approach. Humanists subscribe to the idea that the most meaningful motivations are related to the internal satisfactions that come from doing well, and that students learn to work for their own intrinsic feelings of accomplishment. For example, the inward uplifting feeling you get from presenting a well-prepared report is far more motivating and satisfying than receiving an external reward from the professor, although that is comforting as well. In the behaviorist classroom, students learn to work for rewards given by the teacher. We take no sides on the humanism versus behaviorism issue. Both have strengths and both have limitations. We will be studying the fact that most teaching philosophies are eclectic in nature, and that means we pull a little bit the best, if you will, from all the different paradigms. A good example of the influence of behaviorism in the classroom is programmed instruction, a method of teaching attributed to B.F. Skinner because of his concern about the difficulty in providing suitable academic reinforcements to each student in a class. In programmed instruction, the unit or lesson is broken into a series of very small steps that are presented in sequence. Each step requires a response from the student. If the student is correct, the teacher provides some form of reinforcement such as good for you, yes, great job, and the like, and the student is permitted to move to the next step. If the student is incorrect, he is referred to material designed to teach the concept. In the 1950s and 1960s, programmed instruction was presented in text form. When computers became available, the system was computerized. Typically, in electronic programmed instruction, a piece of information is presented on the screen, and the student is asked to key a response to a question about this information. The computer gives a yes or a no response. If the response is yes, the computer provides reinforcement. If the response is no, the computer refers the student to additional screens that teach the information. After reviewing this additional material, the student tries a similar question. Current applications often bypass the reinforcing and recycling features, but retain the system of presenting the information in small, incremental steps. Because students can work their way through the program without teacher assistance, such programs often are called tutorial programs. You may have used a tutorial program in school, or you may have used one to learn a new computer program. Behaviorism, conditioning students or setting them free. The psychological theory of behavior modification, or behaviorism, is an educational approach that emerged directly from the pioneering research of the late B.F. Skinner, who himself was influenced by the social efficiency movement in education of the 1920s and 1930s. Skinner developed the theory called operant conditioning, which viewed learning as the learner's response to various stimuli, for example, sounds, words, or people, present in the environment. Subscribing to the view that humans learn to act in specific ways based on the response they receive for their actions, generally reward or punishment, the behaviorist teacher believes that learners need incentives, both positive and negative, as motivators to learn. The curriculum is organized in sequenced, discrete segments. Behaviorist teachers will often use objective tests made up predominantly of multiple choice questions to measure how well students have learned the curriculum and to give prompt feedback to students. In some behaviorist classrooms, students are expected to practice a specific skill until they show a certain level of mastery of the skill. In planning for teaching, the behaviorist uses clear objectives, spelled out in terms of the behaviors to be learned, establishes a learning environment which will positively reinforce desired behaviors and eliminate undesired behaviors, and closely monitors and gives the learner feedback on progress until the goal is achieved. Because the same behaviors and knowledge are desirable for all students, standardization of the curriculum and of measuring progress is important. In the 1960s and 1970s, many educators made behaviorism their dominant organizing educational theory. However, This education movement was criticized for being teacher-dominated and causing teachers to treat students as passive objects to be conditioned. Nevertheless, behaviorism remains a dominant theoretical presence, particularly in the areas of special education and classroom discipline. Many teachers rely on behavior modification practices to get students to be quiet when they see or hear the teacher's signal, or to do their best work to get a reward sticker. Critics argue that a behaviorist teacher exercises too much control over students' learning and focuses on the learning of facts rather than deep conceptual knowledge. In response, behaviorist teachers insist that their goal is to eventually put control of learning in their students' hands once they have learned to respond appropriately to the teacher's prompts.
Cognitivism, also called information processing or information processing model, information processing theory or cognitivism, focuses on how the brain processes information by attending to stimuli, receiving information, processing information, storing information in long-term and short-term memory, and retrieving information. According to the information processing approach, often called cognitive psychology or cognitivism, people have the ability to manipulate information in thinking, problem solving, and other intellectual operations by using three basic mental processes: attending to sensory input in the sensory register, encoding the attended information in short-term memory, and retrieving information from the long-term memory. Information processing psychology, or cognitivism, the paradigm, was developed in the late 1950s when computer technology was being developed. It was formed partly as a reaction to limitations seen in the behaviorist approach to education, and partly to use the computer as a model for the way people think. According to the information processing theory, and notice here that they're discussing a particular theory which ties into the paradigm of cognitivism. According to the information processing theory, people first take information into their brains by paying attention, attending, to information coming their way. The information enters the cognitive processing system through the senses and is taken into the sensory register. If the individual does nothing with the information in the sensory register, it is lost. This occurs, for example, when the teacher is lecturing and the student is daydreaming. The teacher's words reach the student's ears and stimulate the hearing receptors, but nothing happens to them in the sensory register. On the other hand, if the person pays attention to the information, it is transferred to the short-term memory where it can be held, processed, and transferred to the long-term memory, or, if nothing is done to process the information, it is lost. Once in long-term memory, the information is never lost, although it may be difficult to retrieve. According to the information processing theory, learning takes place in the short-term memory, where new information and information retrieved from long-term memory interact with each other. The result is a change in memory. It is the teacher's responsibility to help students develop processes that support the needed changes in memory. This is carried out by employing strategies such as the following: organizing information carefully, linking new information to existing knowledge, recognizing the limits of attention, recognizing the limits of short-term memory, and providing encoding strategies to ensure that new information is meaningful. It is important to note that the terms sensory register, short-term memory, and long-term memory refer to processes rather than actual structures. Medical and psychological research currently is taking place to ascertain the actual physiological workings of the brain. Someday we may have information processing models that show how the brain cells themselves work in attending, perceiving, storing, retrieving, and manipulating information. Cognitive psychology. Students as makers of meaning. Over the past 20 years, researchers in both medicine and psychology have been investigating the human brain to find out more about its role in human learning and memory. Cognitive psychologists, drawing heavily on the trailblazing research of Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget, as well as that of the Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky and the American psychologist Jerome Bruner, have discovered a great deal about how people learn to think and solve problems. Their discoveries have led to the development of new theories about learning and cognition that have tremendous implications for how teachers teach. One increasingly popular theory, derived from the research findings, is that in order for new information to be internalized by the learner, it must first be integrated into the learner's pre-existing knowledge base. This process of integration is referred to as constructivism. According to this theory, knowledge cannot be transmitted directly from the teacher to the learner, but is constructed by the learner and later reconstructed as new information becomes available. Instead of seeing students as partially full vessels waiting to be filled, teachers should view them as actively engaged in making meaning. Teachers, therefore, need to create learning situations where students can build their own knowledge, rather than having students sit and listen to the teacher's lectures. Constructivism has become so influential in education in recent years that we give it particular attention here. Constructivists view individuals as having an aversion to disorder. They believe that we are all continually trying to sort things out, to find clues and patterns amid our impressions that will help us to make sense of the world around us. When we encounter something new, say, a strange sound in the night, we immediately attempt to fit it into the patterns or structures we already possess. For example, that's the midnight whistle of the old 98 heading down to New Orleans. But sometimes we encounter new information which leads or forces us to realize that our knowledge base, as it is currently constructed, is incorrect or outdated. The railroad retired that train 2 years ago. We may respond in a number of ways. We search for new input from our senses, seeking either to reconstruct the knowledge base, developing different patterns and structures so that information fits. Maybe that noise was from the hot water boiler and it's about to explode, or maybe that creepy guy from the apartment down below is on my fire escape, or maybe I shouldn't read Stephen King novels before I go to bed. In some instances, we may be so convinced of our knowledge base that we refuse to make allowances for the new information. Now, I'm sure that it was a train whistle. They must have put that train back in service. Students follow the same patterns as they try to make sense of new information they encounter in school. Cognitive psychologists also suggest that we organize our knowledge in ways that allow us easy access to knowledge we use regularly. These cognitive structures, which are called schemas or schemata, change constantly and continually as new information is taken in, hypotheses are developed, and theories are tested. These processes of hypothesis development and testing can be done independently or in interaction with others. Thus, real learning for constructivists involves moving from the trivial pursuit or jeopardy type of factual or declarative knowledge to applicable knowledge. In other words, from knowing what to knowing how. To do this, learners must develop cognitive learning strategies for particular kinds of learning tasks. That is, they have to learn how to think through or go about solving problems. Implications of constructivism for teachers in the classroom. The constructivist teacher does 4 things: actively involves students in real situations, activates students' prior knowledge before presenting new information, uses questions to provoke students' thoughts, and structures learning experiences so that new information is presented in readily accessible forms. At heart, the constructivist teacher behaves more like a coach. Such a teacher is interested primarily in helping the child engage problems and issues, search below the surface, try out various possible solutions or explanations, and finally construct meaning from these experiences. Constructivist classrooms are active places with many opportunities for discovery and experimentation, often a heavy use of cooperative learning, and teachers who are fellow learners rather than fact givers and drill masters. Critics of constructivism claim that its qualities of student-centered and self-constructed learning have led to declines in both academic achievement and classroom discipline. If this is true, it represents a poor application of constructivist principles, which are making their way into our classrooms. In contrast, we believe that constructivism is the linchpin to truly learning to learn. Voices from the classroom. Susan Doherty writes about her career as a 4th grade teacher at Bayberry School in Watchung, New Jersey. Constructivist philosophy. As I began my career in education, I held firm one belief about students. They must be active participants in the classroom. 12 years later, I hold that same basic belief, but have refined what it means for a learner to be active. Early in my career, active meant that my students would not sit in rows and spend the day doing seat work. My first position as a kindergarten teacher quickly revealed that I might strive for something greater than physical activity. Of course, kindergarten students are active. Try and keep them from being anything but active. I came to recognize that while active bodies can be important, what I really wanted was to engage the minds of my students. As I taught students at many elementary levels, I learned to ask probing questions that required my students to consider their learning carefully. How do you know to add these two numbers? What kind of person do you think the main character of the story is? How would you explain why oil floats on water to someone who didn't understand? While my students were often physically active, acting out scenes from a novel we were reading, experimenting with magnets or prisms, or using pattern blocks to build models of math problems, they also spent time physically inert, but inwardly engaged in active thought. Soon, however, I was not satisfied with simply engaging the minds of my students. I wanted to reach their hearts. I wanted to awaken a passion for learning within each student. How might a teacher encourage the awakening of such passion? One key, I think, is to allow and encourage the students to ask and seek the answers to their own questions. One key, I think, is to allow and encourage the students to ask and seek the answers to their own questions. In this way, students' minds and hearts become active, leading them on a lifelong journey of inquiry and self-motivated learning.
Constructivism is an approach to teaching and learning, or another one of our paradigms, that asserts that people actively construct their own understandings of information, that learners combine existing information with new information such that the new knowledge provides personal meaning. In the constructivist paradigm or viewpoint, people build their own knowledge and their own representations of knowledge from their own experience. Learning does not occur by transmitting information from the teacher or the textbook to the student's brain. Instead, each student constructs his or her own personal and valid understanding of this information. Jean Piaget, a Swiss child psychologist, gave structure to the idea of constructivism. Piaget viewed the acquisition of knowledge as a continually developing process rather than as an end state. He viewed the mind as an aggregation of cognitive structures he called schemata, or schema. According to the constructivist paradigm or view, schemata are opened, enlarged, divided, and connected to one another in response to the influx of information into a person's mind. Because no two people experience the same information in the same way, the schemata possessed by each individual are unique to that individual and are linked to one another in ways that represent the unique experiences the individual has had and the unique connections the individual has made between and among those experiences. In a sense, schema theory is like a set of computer files. Each computer user labels files in his or her own way and groups them in folders unique to that person. This is why, by the way, Piaget is often listed under cognitivism as well as constructivism, because Piaget kind of functions in both paradigms. Independently, in the 1920s and 1930s, Lev Vygotsky, a Russian psychologist, also developed basic constructs of constructivism, but his work was not known to the Western world until much later. Whereas Piaget focused on the individual nature of constructing knowledge, Vygotsky emphasized the role other people have in an individual's construction of knowledge. In our computer analogy, Vygotsky would say that a person sets up files in a unique way, but use the input of other people to get started, resulting in some similarities between this person's filing system and that of others. The constructivist teacher helps students make sense by helping each person attach the new information to information he already possesses. This process is often called constructing information, hence the term constructivism. The role of the constructivist teacher is to facilitate learning, to provide a variety of learning experiences that will enable each student to learn in his or her own unique way and construct the information such that it makes sense to the individual. The constructivist teacher asks students for their conclusions and their explanations rather than repetitions of what the teacher presented. To the constructivist teacher, it is far more important to listen than to tell.
Your philosophy of education. At this point, you may well be confused and possibly discouraged. To expect to be able to understand and evaluate critically every aspect of each philosophy is to expect of yourself what few professional philosophers are able to do. What you've just finished reading is a précis of some of the major ideas of Western civilization. Some of these ideas have been around for centuries, and some are the fruits of 20th century thinkers. Selecting the philosophy by which you will live and by which you will guide your professional activities takes much more investment of time, thought, and energy than reading our short chapter. Some teachers, like the teacher philosophers in this chapter, settle on one philosophical view, and that view structures all of their work. Other teachers lean strongly toward a particular philosophy, even if they may not be fully conscious of their position or be able to give it a proper philosophical label. Typically, they have a particular view of the learner, of how the learner should be approached, and of what is most worth knowing. However, few teachers are philosophical purists. Some teachers, recognizing that they draw ideas from various philosophies, label themselves as eclectics. But what does it really mean to be an eclectic in contemporary education? Eclecticism, not an excuse for sloppy thinking. Eclecticism embodies the idea that truth can be found anywhere, and therefore people should select from various doctrines, systems, and sources. The eclectic teacher selects what he or she believes to be the most attractive features of several philosophies. For example, the teacher might take from Romanticism the innate curiosity of the learner, and from Essentialism a curricular viewpoint dominated by the criterion of usefulness. Eclecticism is quite popular, but often for the wrong reasons. It sometimes appears as the easy way out of philosophical uncertainty, just taking what you please from the philosophical cafeteria of ideas. Let's see now. I think I'll begin with a light salad of romantic individuality and follow that up with a main course of progressive problem-solving projects, but with some hearty perennialist classics as side dishes. And oh yes, let's finish with a popular and tasty dessert of essentialist vocational training. One problem with this approach is the possibility of inconsistency. To take one's view of society from the romantic, who gives primacy to individual freedom, and one's teaching methodology from the progressivist, who stresses group membership and democratic process, is liable to make everyone confused. Selecting eclecticism cannot be an excuse for lazy thinking. On the other hand, most teachers feel quite free and justified in borrowing teaching methodologies and strategies that are associated with various philosophies of education. The ardent perennialist teacher may choose to involve his or her sixth grade students in a hands-on project constructing a large topographical map of Odysseus's 10-year journey to his home after the fall of Troy. Conversely, the free-spirited romantic teacher may insist that each student memorize and be able to recite 50 lines from the Odyssey. Although this type of eclecticism may, in a narrow sense, seem philosophically inconsistent, at its root is the recognition that no philosophy of education is able to dictate the ideal methodology or learning strategies for all situations or all students trying to learn all subject matter. Related to this is the growing realization that different students possess a great range of learning styles, and that what works with one student may flop with another. In sum, eclecticism can be a serious philosophical position, and eclecticism in the selection of teaching strategies is quite justified. But again, the choice to be eclectic should not be a substitute for sloppy thought. We're not suggesting that you sit yourself down, think through all these issues, and come up with a tight set of philosophical answers that will last the rest of your lifetime. Rather, we hope that we have focused or refocused your attention on some of life's most critical questions and on some issues that are at the very core of teaching. One purpose of the general education component of teacher education programs, that is, the courses in the arts and sciences required of the prospective teacher, is to provide a chance for future teachers to think through these fundamental questions of human existence. A primary purpose of the college curriculum is to present the student with a spectrum of society's best thinkers and their attempts to understand their own existence. On the other hand, the infamous college bull sessions may be where the real philosophy inquiry goes on. They are frequently thinly veiled discussions of what really counts in life and what one should try to do with one's life. In effect, then, both the formal apparatus of college and its curriculum and the informal opportunities to meet, talk, and test your ideas with a variety of people should help you discover where you stand on some of these essential human questions. As we said, the teacher who will be more than a technician has an obligation to take philosophical issues and questions seriously. Teachers owe it to themselves and to their students to understand where they are going and why they are going there. On the other hand, teachers owe it to themselves to make sure that the schools they work in are hospitable, and certainly not hostile, to their own philosophies of education. It is important, therefore, that you be ready both to discuss your own philosophy of education with prospective employers and to inquire about the district's or school's philosophy. However, do not expect those interviewing you to be able to define their schools precisely according to particular philosophies described in this chapter. Although educators live out a philosophy of education, we are not always able easily to capture it in words.